Welcome to the Fire by the Fire podcast. My name is Sean Scallon, and I'm a managing partner at Kingsgate Capital Partners. Thank you again for joining us. These short, sharp podcasts are designed to provide allocators and influencers of capital with a deeper understanding of the managers we represent and their strategies. In this episode, we have Luke Sanders from Foxglove Defence and John McClure, who is a deep tech investor and strategist specializing in the inflection points where technical validation meets commercial scale. Great to have you both on the show. Over to you, John.
Thanks, Sean. And Luke, welcome to the Five by the Fire podcast. Thanks very much for making the time to share your insights with us. So just a little bit of background. The format for the Five by the Fire podcast is that I'm going to ask you, of course, 5 questions, hopefully interesting questions, and let you take it from there. Does that sound okay?
Yeah, thanks. Really looking forward to it. Thank you, John.
Great. So before we get started, can I ask you to give us a bit of your background and a Foxglove? Because I think it's both, germane to the subject and the questions at hand, but also really interesting.
Yeah, thanks, John. And it's not something that I typically like doing, but yeah, I appreciate that it's important to understand where we're coming from. And so I draw on sort of nearly 3 decades of military experience, and over 2 decades of that was spent with the Australian Special Air Service Regiment, including multiple command roles and deployments across the Middle East and Indo-Pacific. A large part of that was actually spent, though, operating at the forward edge. And what I see is not simply just about conducting operations. It's about integrating, intelligence, technology, interagency capability, and coalition partnerships into these adaptive operational systems. And so over time, watching that shift from, what it was, 20, 30 years ago to what it is now, we saw quite a significant shift. And that shift moving away from those highly centralized platform-focused models towards the more smaller, more networked and technological integration of systems that could adapt faster was a really key inflection moment for me. And part of my role was helping driving that transition operationally and integrating more technically enabled capabilities, interagency coordination and across the coalitions. So that experience has really shaped how I think about defence technology today. And I also feel that the future battlefield was increasingly more of an adaptation competition. So no longer simply building advanced technology, it was identifying what actually works operationally and then integrating effectively, deploying it faster and making sure we're ahead of where the competitors might be. And one of the advantages of coming from a special operations sort of background is we are a global community and we're relatively small, trusted and highly networked. So those relationships have provided very, very useful insight into where that demand or that operational demand is emerging and what problems our partners are generally trying to solve. And so following my military career, I really wanted to apply that perspective to an investment and innovation side. So that led to Foxglove Defence, where we've partnered with a range of different sort of specialised capabilities with an operator-led focus, but the platform integrates a range of different financial experts as well to that operator-led platform where we can focus on delivering accelerated, trusted technologies into those deployment pathways that we think can make a difference to national security.
Really interesting. I'm glad you're able to share that with the audience. So with that, let me just kick off and we'll roll through this. So going back to something you just said around, decision making and the changing nature of warfare, we are in one of the biggest military build-outs, I think the world's ever seen with the EU, the US, and then our relative other folks in the world. And so, defense spending has really changed in recent times, and now it represents close to $3 trillion globally. And with 40% of that spend going to advanced technologies, can you talk us through how you and the team at Foxglove look at investing into that kind of environment?
Yeah, it's really interesting, John. I think, we see a real major shift, absolutely, in defence spending. And what we mean by that is the uplift, but really it's about where that spending is moving to. So these modern challenges, national security challenges and conflicts that are occurring globally, they're forcing militaries to prioritise adaptation, speed, autonomy, AI-enabled systems, resilient communications, they're kind of buzzwords that are out there, but what it's becoming and what we're seeing is the battlefield is increasingly software defined and data driven. So that's how we think about it from a Foxglove perspective. And we don't see ourselves as a generalist venture capital firm that just happens to invest in defence. We actually built Foxglove on this theory that you need operator-led platform to understand where that operational demand is emerging, because that's where the funding is going to follow. And so as this shift occurs, and don't get me wrong, those priority systems will still remain. There will still be those exquisite systems and those primes needing to, but it's importantly how we think through this globally rather than through, this simple view that defence technology is coming. And what we see is the different regions are solving these problems differently as well. So understanding what's coming out of Eastern Europe, where that's driving lessons around scalable mass and resilience. Israel focusing still on accelerating rapid, technological capabilities, with the Indo-Pacific as well reshaping sort of maritime autonomy. So I think understanding all those capabilities and where those allied ecosystems are shifting and the money therefore shifting as well is really important. So rather than concentrating narrowly just on one geography and one of those technologies, we look to ultimately understand how the future battlefield is becoming less platform and more adaptation competition.
Oh, really interesting. And I'll get to that platform question in a second, but I wanted to focus on something you just said around, one, the global nature of warfare and of defense capabilities, but also, as you talked about the different regions, one concept or thesis that keeps coming up, or especially around tech, is this idea of sovereign capability. And so I'd like to ask you, what does sovereign capability mean, in defense? And as you and the Foxglove team are looking at defense investments, how do you balance that betting on emerging tech, long timelines of government contracts, and also the nature of wanting sovereign capability in those contracts? So it's a big question, but I'll let you unpack it.
Yeah, thanks. Look, I think sovereign capability is misunderstood. But not in terms of, the principle of it, but certainly for us, it doesn't mean trying to build everything domestically. I think it's about assuring, trusted access, resilience and control over the capabilities that matter most during periods where strategic pressure requires it. And so this could mean sovereign manufacturing. It also could mean trusted, software layers, sustainment capability, supply chain and operational integration. Most of the time we'll ask those questions like, what capability do they actually want to control during a crisis? But also you need to balance out those those cycles of technology against the defence procurement timelines, which is a challenge. And as much as, there is a lot of institutional, momentum to change that, it remains a challenge. The way we approach it is more about, where is that capability likely to be adopted first? How does it prove its operational relevance? And then how do we transition that into the right allied markets? Now, if capability needs to be sovereign, then we will protect that sovereignty as it requires. And yes, sovereignty is something that can be commercialized now. But in the end, we prefer technologies that have that near-time operational utility, coalition relevance, dual-use pathways, and the ability to integrate into existing systems. And this is all about that operational urgency. And then you need to work out which part of that system you actually want to protect from the sovereign. And I think if you try and reverse engineer that, you will end up in a smaller pocket where you're just not adapting to the pace it needs to in the environment.
It's really interesting in that, you have so much, you see it in the EU right now, which is, it's not the EU, it's Germany spending for Germany, France spending for France. And so it's a really interesting lens you put on that, on how you approach that dynamic of both the technology changing the capabilities, but also how do you invest into that thesis. Building from there, another paradigm shift that I know, we've talked about before that I think, is really interesting is where procurement is being done, and so this, notably coming out of the U.S., where the Department of Defense or Department of War, whatever, it's being called in this day, has now shifted, procurement decision making to the warfighters, your old role, and really folks at the front line. and empowering those commanders and units, such as special forces, to have much greater autonomy and power to determine which technologies they require and who is the best supplier. So given the rapid evolution and nature of modern warfare equipment and how so much of it is now dependent on leading edge tech, and given your background leading those teams, how do you see this new decision-making, procurement paradigm impacting your investment focus?
Yeah, I mean, we are absolutely seeing a shift to decentralized military innovation. Historically, capability development is highly centralized, large procurement systems operating over long timelines, whereas, operational units, and that's been, my background, those special forces or those specialist missions units are increasingly acting as those early indicators in the past. But now the whole mechanism, that whole institutional shift means that they really need to optimize heavily for that adaptability and mission effectiveness. So that's not just about building technology. It's about shortening that feedback loop between operators, industry and deployment. And that's where I truly believe one of our edges, exists. Like our differentiated capability is that operator network across Australia, the UK, the US, Middle East, Israel, how we bring that, understanding to the forward edge and help adapt those industry partners or our ventures that we invest in quickly in order to get them to be adopted quickly and therefore provide our investors the best return we can.
Well, building on that question and looking ahead, I'd like you to, look in your crystal ball and sort of give us an idea of which technology do you think will attract the most capital or most venture investment over the next decade. And you've mentioned a couple names. I think it's really interesting that as you look at both Ukraine and Israel bringing missile and drone defense capabilities to the Middle East, not your usual bedfellows, but it's changing the way that people both look at where to invest and what to invest in. And again, you bring it back to the point, it's a lot of global players coming about where capability has developed quickly for obvious reasons. So just want to get your thoughts on sort of what are those technologies you think you're hearing the most interest from your fellow, alumnus from the community.
Yeah, and look, obviously there is a lot of, discussion about this, is it drones? Is it, this system again, that's that platform focus. From my perspective, the biggest shift is, it's about integrated adaptive systems. So, focusing on singular exquisite platforms is not going to give you the competitive advantage. So yeah, autonomy, clearly major driver, low cost, scalable, attributable systems, absolutely. And across those domains, which are complex. But actually my view, what I think is really important is this layer of orchestration. And that sits at that's how you get from sense, decide and act in a more rapid way. This is about faster decision-making cycles. And so connecting those sensors, autonomous systems, communications, decision-making, operators into a coherent operational architecture, that's what's actually going to generate the advantage into the future. So you need to invest in those resilient communications, electronic warfare, positioning systems. You need to bring all those parts together in order to actually, demonstrate and deliver that orchestration layer.
All right. Well, I've reached my fifth question, so I'm going to try and wrap a lot of the things that we just covered up into this, all-encompassing final question. I'm going to tie it back to something that's, I think near and dear to, Australia's heart, which is, the AUKUS program. And we know, I think there's two parts of the program. So AUKUS I is building nuclear-powered submarines. That's the realm of the big, tier one providers and the big money being spent. But maybe fewer people understand what AUKUS II is, which is really about funding and developing the advanced capabilities and technologies you just talked about, sensors, software, across, a partnership with Australia, the UK, and the US. And so, given that that's happening in our home turf of Australia, but also, leveraging the US and the UK, can you talk about how Foxglove is positioning itself for investment into AUKUS outside of, the US and the obvious, sort of tier one players?
Yeah, thank you. And you're exactly right. Pillar two is exciting. It's a broader, it's recognizing that, strategic reality that, we now need to integrate technology much faster than traditional systems have allowed us to do. So, it's not just a simple Australia, US or UK relationship. It actually becomes a networked, trusted, allied ecosystem that, you can operate across multiple markets. And this is about how do you integrate sensor systems coming out of, our allied partners in Southeast Asia, for example. How do you partner and integrate NATO systems? It is a complex requirement, and these are different domains. So we designed Foxglove specifically for this. So it's not just a domestic investment fund for us. We are a platform where we build incubation capabilities, advisory capabilities, operator networks, because that adoption is rarely just about capital. It's about having, procurement access, understanding sovereign requirements, integration pathways, and those coalition relationships. And, part of our role is helping our investments navigate those environments earlier and position them into these allied capability gaps where, not just that demand is increasing, but where we can actually assist, because a stronger allied network is a better deterrence than just a singular outcome. And therefore, building out those Indo-Pacific, Middle East, Eastern Europe, those manufacturing ecosystems, India, all these places which are at the leading edge of certain parts of that ecosystem, we can't just rely solely on our individual trilateral partnerships.
It is. I think it really requires in investing in this space that the specialist, knowledge that you and the team bring. So again, I wanted to thank you again for sharing your insights. This is a really rapidly changing world of defense technology and procurement, especially, you're changing both the technology and the procurement at the same time. So I think we both agree, this is a fairly radical change to what is and has been a very traditional industry. So thanks again. And for our listeners, look, I will say that Luke and I could have gone on for an hour or two on this, but, if you're interested in finding out more about Foxglove Defense and the industry, please get in contact with the Kingsgate Capital Partners team, and we'll set up a call for you and Luke and the team over at Foxglove. Thanks again for listening to 5 by the Fire.